Hello and thank you for joining us at today's webinar. My name is Andrew Regal, the technical lead at the training team for Alcumus. I'm joined by Helen Tucker, one of our tutors in the training team. Today we're going to be talking about health and safety competent persons, what SMEs need to know. So we'll be talking for roughly 20 minutes or so. So to begin with, I'll be talking about the legal side of it and the theory behind why all businesses need to have appointed competent persons. And then we'll be handing over to my colleague Helen, who will be discussing how this applies to SMEs in practice. Okay, so the topics that we'll be covering today include what is competency, in terms of what that term actually means. We'll be looking at the legal requirements for the appointment of competent persons, the roles and responsibilities of competent persons in terms of what it is that they're actually expected to be doing, and then finally SMEs and competent persons in practice. So first of all, we'll be looking at what is competency. For competency then, according to the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, a person shall be regarded as competent where they have sufficient training and experience or knowledge and other qualities. And so the key parts to really take from that are training, experience, knowledge and other qualities. So competency can be taken as a combination of those factors. So looking specifically at training for a moment, training, where it is used, must also be delivered by competent trainers with experience of the material being delivered and of the needs of the trainees. Or this can be delivered via e-learning where relevant, of course. So the method of delivery of the training, the setting of and any materials used or distributed to the trainees should be appropriate for the jobs, the experience and needs of the trainees. It's also important to bear in mind that refresher training may also need to be provided. And where formal qualifications or courses of training are undertaken, the professional or vocational bodies providing the training may recommend an appropriate interval after which refresher training would be undertaken, or for professional roles, there'll be requirements for recording continuing professional development. So beyond this, however, employers will need to decide the frequency of refresher training. This can be undertaken as part of the process of conducting a training needs analysis, with refresher training being incorporated into the employee's training plans. So we move on to determining competency. So how do we know whether somebody has the required level of competence? Once employers are familiar with relevant legislation and appropriate guidance relevant to their workplace, they can analyse the competency needs of their situation. So competency should be related to functions, jobs or processes undertaken in the workplace. Clear standards should be developed, as this will allow those carrying out the work, as well as those supervising it, to conclusively know whether they possess the necessary competency. So workers involved in duties beyond their normal work, for instance, such as first aiders, fire marshals, and safety representatives, should also have account taken of these roles when their competence is being considered. So furthermore, clear standards of competency can also help employers when recruiting workers to determine suitability. In some cases, it will be necessary to refer to approved codes of practice or HSE or industry guidance, which may specify particular levels of training or competence, for example, in the use of lift trucks. For existing workers whose competency is to be established, sustained or improved, the initial step will be to conduct a training needs analysis, which should be specific to the combination of job or role and the person. So for SMEs, this need not be a complex exercise, and my colleague Helen will discuss this further in an SME context. So a new analysis will need to be carried out where a role is subsequently filled by a different employee or where an employee moves to a different position in the organisation. Once this analysis has been carried out, decisions can then be made on the most appropriate mode of developing competency. This may include training to improve skills or knowledge, instruction, supervision to allow workers to add to their experience, or the obtaining of formal qualifications. Training can be provided in-house or externally in a variety of modes appropriate to the worker, the employer, and the workplace. The appropriate mix of activities necessary to develop competence can be formulated on a worker-by-worker basis in the form of personal training plans. Verification should also be carried out to ensure that the worker has developed the required competency. This may be done through job observation, written, practical or oral tests, or discussions. It should also be noted that the process is cyclical and ongoing. Employees should be subject to periodic and continual review to ensure their competency remains up to date and relevant. Training, refresher training, and the other activities associated with competence should be provided on an ongoing basis. Records of all these activities should be kept to better inform the process of developing competency and also for use in the investigation of an accident or incident. Such records will also be useful in the event of the organisation being inspected, subject to enforcement action, prosecuted or sued. So moving on to the legal requirements. So as we've mentioned, it's the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulation 1999, where this requirement stems from. So looking specifically at Regulation 7, it says every employer shall, subject to paragraphs 6 and 7, appoint one or more competent persons to assist him in undertaking the measures he needs to take to comply with the requirements and prohibitions imposed upon him by or under the relevant statutory provisions. So this means as an employer, you must appoint a competent person to help you meet your health and safety duties. So a competent person is not someone who simply has the competence to carry out a particular task safely. In general terms, the definition of a competent person, as we've already discussed, is someone who has the necessary skills, experience, and knowledge to generally manage health and safety. So looking briefly at the notion of liability for a competent person and the liability that they may attract when taking on this role. So a competent person attracts a higher degree of responsibility because of their competence. Their competence means that others should be able to rely on their advice to a greater degree. As a result, the competent person also attracts a greater liability than if they were an ordinary employee, especially in the area of negligence. So if they give advice that is wrong, or they fail to act on information or take action, they may be judged liable if a comparably competent employee would have acted differently. In terms of civil liability, however, any action for damages will normally be brought against the employer of the competent person, who will be vicariously liable for their actions in the normal course of their employment. The employer will also generally be insured for such liability under their employer's liability policy, their public liability, or if providing professional services or advice, the professional indemnity policy. So while not expected to display exceptional abilities, competent employees are expected to act in a manner that is reasonable considering their competence, experience, and training. Where they fail to do so and risk arises as a result, the possibility of prosecution under the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act 1974 or other legislation arises. It is, however, important to remember that it is still relatively rare for this to happen, and it is, as we say, usually action that is brought against the employer. So moving on to the roles and responsibilities of the competent person. So what is it that they are expected to do? So typically, a competent person could be expected to understand the application of the Health and Safety at Work Act 1974 and other legislation relevant to the company's business. You'll need to keep up to date with changes in current legislation and to bring to the attention of the director responsible for health and safety any relevant new legislation. They'll need to attend such courses or seminars run by external sources to enable accurate interpretation of legislation, to enable implementation within the organisation. They'll need to ensure that all assessments, as required by legislation, are conducted and reviewed at relevant intervals, and to maintain records of the same. That would include, of course, risk assessments. They'll need to recommend control measures and advise on the standard of PPE issued to employees. They'll also need to conduct health and safety inspections and prepare reports of all the company's operations. They'll need to immediately contact the director responsible for health and safety if situations are found that, in the opinion of the safety manager, require immediate rectification or the stopping of any operation. They'll need to notify the director responsible for health and safety if corrective action agreed after any workplace inspection is not implemented by the arranged date. They'll need to carry out investigations into all accidents and near-miss incidents and to record the findings on the relevant forms. They'll need to advise senior management of all incidents reportable under the RIDDLE, that's the Reporting of Injuries, Diseases and Dangerous Occurrences regulations. So they will also need to arrange for health surveillance where necessary, highlight areas where training or certification is required to meet the standards imposed by legislation, approved codes of practice or HSE guidance. They may need to bring in new techniques for improving health, safety and welfare to the attention of the director responsible for health and safety, and assist with workforce consultation. Importantly, they'll need to set a personal example by wearing appropriate personal protective clothing or equipment and observing all safety requirements and procedures themselves. And finally, where appropriate, they'll need to assist in the development of policies, procedures and safe systems of work. So for the next part, I will be handing over to my colleague, Helen Tucker, who will be talking about competent persons, specifically in the context of SMEs.
Great, lovely. Hi everyone, and thanks Andrew. So when we discuss and look at competent persons, the first questions SMEs can ask themselves is, who do I actually appoint? Is that somebody that's within my organisation? Is it myself as a director, owner of a business, or whether I need external help and advice? So that question always comes back down to taking the consideration of what is the nature and the tasks and the level of risk that your business has. As you can appreciate, a small manufacturing outlet would have a very different risk perspective as perhaps a self-employed hairdresser that was mobile for their clients, because the hazards that they were being exposed to and having the degree of having to manage would be greatly different. So occasionally businesses will, or owners themselves may need to bring in an external person to carry out specific tasks or activities, especially if it's of a specialised field that they may not have that expertise in. So it can be under specific legislation or due to a specific nature of the hazard. So for an example would be if you required noise assessment and that your machinery had specific noise levels. Again, it's starting to look at hazardous activity that goes beyond the just general health and safety advice that practitioners or competent persons usually have. So that's when you would seek more specialised and external companies. And when deciding who to choose, it's not always a straightforward way of being able to apply your own internal selection procedures. You sometimes have to go that little bit further beyond. So if you are going to then seek external help and advice, you feel that there isn't anybody suitable within your own business, and as we talk about, it's not necessarily that they have to have a high level of knowledge of health and safety legislation, but it's about their expertise and competence. So if you're going to choose an external consultant, what you have to remember is that there are several sources of where you can seek a approved list or recommendations, which can come from your insurance company. But certainly the main methods that on a practical basis that small and medium-sized enterprises use is very much looking at, do they have a membership of a relevant or respected trade or professional organisation? So, for example, if it was in relation to fire, what membership of any fire associations or bodies do they have to supplement and support their knowledge and experience? Competent persons also, are they a member of IOSH, the Institution of Organisational Safety and Health, to, again, at the required level, is always looking at the level of expertise as required. This from membership and affiliate levels right through to corporate and chartered membership, which again will have a higher degree of knowledge for that competent person. So it's always going back to the drawing board, remembering what it is and the level of hazard and activities that you're dealing with that will help frame the level of competency in that consultant that you will be looking for. Remember, go back to basics. We always know you wouldn't hire a contractor if they didn't have any references or any recommendations from other organisations. So you may have contacts within your area and the field of industry that you work in, and they may be able to recommend a provider that they've used previously. You might want to look at testimonials or recommendations from websites. They also are a really good indicator of how well a consultant works, history of previous activities that they've undertaken, to be able to see whether they will be the right provider or right consultant for you. And there's also the government initiated Occupational Health and Safety Consultants Register, because not only will you have larger consultancies based companies, there will be a lot of individual one-to-one self-employed consultants. And going to use a register of that level of expertise is securing your knowledge that you are getting the right person, the ones that have the right insurance supporting them, the right knowledge, so that you know that that criteria of assessment has been undertaken by somebody else, and that you know that you can be confident in who you are recruiting and employing to do that work. And also remember, Alcumus, as a provider of consultancies, it's always a field that we'll be able to help in that capacity, and have a wide range of knowledgeable consultants in specialised fields. So never be afraid, contact us, and we can certainly point you to the right department or consultant that can help. When we look at whether it is from an external company or whether you are deciding to choose perhaps an employee of your organisation, that may be a supervisor, an employee that's shown an interest in health and safety. A key point in practice, certainly ones that you need to consider in that selection, is what attributes do that person have? Because you want to make sure you're choosing the right person for the job, but the right person for you and for your company. So of course, predominantly the importance is having experience and training in being able to identify hazards and carrying out risk assessments. It is the foundation upon all health and safety management. It's the basics that they will need to understand. So that they are aware of hazards, are they aware of the risk assessment techniques and how to apply them? And again, it's also important for them to have knowledge of the process and activity. It's very difficult to put a person in that may have no knowledge of perhaps a chemical-based business if they've not worked in that industry before or in that particular process. So having that knowledge actually helps assist to get the best recommendations to identify hazards and the control measures that need to be implemented. We talk about an attribute of having technical knowledge of plant or equipment. And I just remember, from an SME perspective, this isn't always a relation that you would have to know the ins and outs, the intricate workings of equipment. Sometimes the important part is knowing your own limitations of your knowledge and experience, and being able to know when to seek that with external help and advice. As a health and safety practitioner and consultant, I might not have the intricate knowledge of how a power press works. I would have a basic understanding of the hazards and the precautions, but the mechanisms of how that operates isn't going to be something that I would be expected to know. But as a consultant or a competent person, I would work with those people, individuals that have that knowledge, whether that be the maintenance manager, production manager, so they have that technical expertise, or an engineer. So it's knowing that you don't have to know everything. No one does, but it's getting that help and advice when you know it and know your limitations. Good communication and report writing skills is important, because you need to influence management to take action. Are you clear in what you are being able to communicate, not using too much technical jargon, so that whoever's reading the policies, procedures, risk assessments that are being compiled, that are written in a way that everyone understands? We talk about the ability to apply legislation and guidance, and that's nothing to be too fearful of. It's about knowing what is suitable and sufficient risk assessment, for an example. So what should that assessment cover? Does this legislation and guidance apply to me and my business? So again, it's nothing to be too worried about. It's just applying, and we use this term so frequently that people forget it's common sense. And sometimes we need to revert back to that from an SME perspective, and make sure they have the right attitude for the task. You want somebody that's going to be positive about health and safety, want to do the role, because if they want to do it, they will do it well, they will do it efficiently and effectively. So you're going to get the best out of the job that you're going to do. As Andrew discussed earlier, we talk about training, what level of training needs to be asked, and a common question that does always come up is, well, what should the level of training be? What course is recommended? What must they have? And you need to remember that there is no course specified in law that will dictate that a competent person has to have. Again, that level of training is going to be determined between the complexity and the level of risk involved. So as we talk about, you look at if it was a very low risk environment, sort of as I just mentioned earlier, your hairdressers, 3 or 4 staff, IOSH managing safely, which gives you that level of basic foundation to managing health and safety in the workplace, is more than sufficient. However, we talk, you may be an employer of a manufacturing plant with 200 employees, and the complexities surrounding noise, machinery safety, vibration may be very technically related, and you might feel that you need to seek a competent person with the NEBOSH diploma or NVQ level. So it's remembering it's a very open-ended area. It's about choosing the right qualification and course for you. And again, always remember, if you're unsure, you can always contact us here at Alchemist, and we can always point you in the right direction. We will always recommend the one that's most appropriate to you in your situation and business. So when we talk about the training needs analysis, and that's not a complicated process, it's looking at what you have in your business in the first instance, the level of training, the level of knowledge those staff have, and what shortfall does there appear to be. Somebody may have extreme knowledge in the equipment and the machinery that's being used, but might have never had any theoretical knowledge around the Health and Safety at Work Act, risk assessments, or about the provision of use of work equipment regulations. That can be quite a new area. So in which case you are just going to supplement that training with perhaps some theoretical knowledge. So again, don't overcomplicate things. It's about literally seeing what you have. Is there any gaps? If so, how are you going to fill those gaps? And an important step that a lot of businesses forget, certainly when you're employing internal or using internal staff, it's to make sure that you verify their competency, follow up with some observations. So ask the production manager or a machinery manager that can come and observe that competent person within the workplace to ensure that they are understanding what it is their expectations are they working to the level of your expectations. And you can do that by, I said, working together as a team. But rightly so, as you would follow up a competent person, making sure that they're delivering what it is that you're contracting them to deliver. And there's lots of further information in the World Wide Web that you can seek for external help and advice on the matter. So we've got the Consultants Register in front of you. The Health and Safety Executive website has so much useful information for SMEs in a very practical how-to guides. So again, it's not something that you have to be overly complicated about. They've produced a lot of templates and things that you are able to use yourselves. IOSH website for, again, useful information, articles, guidance publications, as well as member areas. NEBOSH, the National Examination Board for Occupational Safety and Health, their website is detailed in order for you to seek details about the types of qualifications that are available. So again, for you to help with your analysis of which qualification fits you. The Federation of Small Business is a really good, useful tool. Again, produces useful guidance and recommendations for small businesses on managing health and safety. And last but not least, we have the Alchemist website. We have a variety of services that we can meet that are a basic standard level and standard packages, but also can be bespoke and be tailored to your individual needs. Never be afraid to answer the question. We can always recommend and build and tailor our packages to suit the needs for what you're actually looking for. So it just gives me an opportunity to say thank you ever so much for listening and joining in our webinar today. We will now go through the questions that you have all been asking us. So the first question that was presented is, what will happen if I don't have a competent person employed? So as we've already discussed in the webinar, it is a legal requirement, as we said, under the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999, to appoint a competent person. So in failing to appoint that person, it is ultimately a breach of the legislation. You're failing to comply with the law that is set down. But hopefully what the key message is that, as I said, it's about choosing that right person within your organisation. It's not always having to appoint somebody external. So even if that is at a minimum level, you having somebody that is having that responsibility to manage and take health and safety forward. Because in fairness, the level of penalty awarded to businesses is going to be dependent on the circumstances of each case. It does depend, has an accident happened, what was the severity and the circumstances surrounding that, or was it a near miss and an inspector has identified that no competent person was in place. So again, it does depend on those circumstances, but in general, the consequences could be an improvement notice in which a HSE or local authority inspector would give you a set time in order to put that competent person in place. Worst case scenario, depending on if a high risk accident occurred and somebody was seriously injured or a fatality, penalties for regulations can lead up to 12 months in prison or an unlimited fine. Those improvement notices or prosecutions are listed on a public database that can be easily accessed from a HSE point of view. So it does go into the public domain, which can then in turn have an impact on your reputation, future business and contracts. So there is that serious nature surrounding there. You legally have to provide somebody that's going to have the competency to manage health and safety within the business. But just remember, health and safety is good business, and in the long term saves you money. When you think about the hidden costs that can be incurred, whether that's retraining staff, temporary staff, breakdown of machinery, that is all something that is attributed to the bottom line. So by investing now in that correct competency level, internally or externally, is going to avoid those consequences happening. And as I've said, it's not a complicated process to go through. It's something that you can do yourselves and supplement that with external help and advice when you need it.
Okay, so moving on to the next question, which has been submitted. We've been asked, how do I know if my competent person has enough experience or knowledge? So this is where the gap analysis that we talked about earlier will play its part. It's basically looking at that shortfall between where you are now and where you need to be. So this will help you to determine what knowledge the individual has already in relation to health and safety, specifically surrounding hazard identification and risk assessment techniques applicable to the business. So you can look at previous training courses that they may have attended already. You'll be looking at how long ago that training was attended. So it could be that just a short refresher training course will be sufficient. There may only be a need to supplement experience with some theoretical knowledge just to back that up. So where you can select a familiarity course, such as IOSH Managing Safely. Where the business is more complex or high risk, such as manufacturing, for instance, you may require a higher level of knowledge. So therefore, something like an EBOSH course or an NV2 may be appropriate. So you also need to look at the experience that person has within the related business. So for example, the competent person may have worked within the construction industry for a period of several years in a variety of roles, and therefore has significant knowledge of safe and best practice. So while an apprentice or someone relatively new to the business, for instance, may not have built up sufficient experience to be an appropriate choice. So in contrast, you may have someone relatively new in the industry, but has undertaken a similar competent person role previously, and those skills can be transferable when necessary, and they will seek to supplement their knowledge with specific advice as and when needed. So remember, there's not always a clear answer. It's about applying your judgment depending on the individual in question. So it's about applying common sense as you would to the recruitment of any job role. So it's no more complex than that. Where in doubt, of course, you can always seek advice from any of the useful organisations that we referenced towards the end of the webinar, and that includes Alcumus, IOSH and the FSB, for instance.
The third question that was presented is that once you've identified a suitable course for the competent person, what learning or study options are available? Now, it's understanding there are various ways in the modern world of individuals being able to undertake educational courses. That can be classroom-based, face-to-face sessions, or a block period or day release, depending on the structure of the course being run. There's also e-learning or online-based facilities, which provides a lot of flexibility around learning, can be picked up around current workload, personal commitments, but still providing student and tutor contact, and is also considered a valuable option if you're unable to release staff for long periods of time due to sort of business constraints or commitments. And in some cases, it's a blended learning approach where you can do a mixture of both. So again, what is key in choosing the study mode mode is about learner and what their preferences and learning needs are, because everyone is different and not one size fits all. So it's to achieve the best results, it's about marrying the two together, tailoring them to those individuals. What's going to be the best method for your staff or your person, competent person that's going to be doing the role? So if you're not sure, approach the individual, ask them. They should form part of their own learning needs, their own learning analysis, and what their particular preferences and what has worked well for their learning needs in the past. But again, additionally, the training provider that you go to can certainly help and advise on the best method. That includes alchemists as well, or whether or not anything needs to be tailored specifically for your learners' needs.
Okay, so we're now looking at our final question. So we are a small roofing company with 10 employees, and what is required for us? So whilst we can't provide a categorical answer in the context of this webinar, we can say that you will be required to have a competent person who, in addition to any appropriate CSCS card and suitable amount of experience, you may need to look at something like a MIOSH Managing Safely course, for instance, just to provide that additional theoretical knowledge, because that is a potentially higher risk activity that is taking place there. So that concludes today's webinar. To help us improve our future webinars, there is a survey at the end of this, so we'd be really grateful if you could complete that. So thank you all very much for attending, and we hope that this has proved to be beneficial for you.